Pretty exciting stuff. Really awesome to be able to dream. Not just about what's going on here, but just for the whole city and for the world as well. And the impact that we have locally and globally is just amazing for this little congregation that started out in 1994 with just a handful of people, which is up to over 1,200 or so today. Several years ago, on a beautiful early summer evening, Dill Dickinson, who sometimes plays the keyboards up here, some of you would remember him, we ran up to the summit of Green Mountain. Green Mountain is that 8,400 peak just behind us, and took about an hour and 15 minutes to get up there. And when we got there, we just sat and talked, and then we began to pray. And then we realized that the sun had already dipped behind the Continental Divide and that we would lose our light pretty quickly. So we got up and hustled down the trail. By the time we were only halfway down, it's pitch dark. We could see the lights of Boulder, but we couldn't see our feet in front of us. And what made it worse is we're a couple of old guys, and we have no artificial light source. Didn't bring our cell phones with us, didn't have a flashlight, no headlamp. And so we decided we'd pack together, we'd stay together, right, until we either needed to spend the night up there or made our way down to the trailhead. And it wasn't too long that because of the adrenaline, and I was out in the lead, that I heard this faint voice from way behind me saying, "I thought we were going to stick together." Oops. Survival of the fittest, baby. Okay. It took a couple of hours, and many of those, much of that time, we were down literally on our hands and feet trying to figure out where the trailhead was at, but we made it back a couple hours later. The truth is that I'm not always the best leader, and I'm even less of a good follower. And honestly, I don't think it's possible to be a good leader unless you know how to be a good follower. And today, as we continue in this series called Dream Bolder, I want to talk about what it means to be a good follower of God, which is what the Israelites had to do once they crossed through the parting waters of the Red Sea and were immediately brought into the desert for the next 40 years. If they were going to survive in this harsh environment of the Sinai, they would need to move quickly from being wanderers to being followers, which is the title of today's message. And there's a lot about their journey that we can learn for our own journey through life, because if you haven't noticed by now, and you will eventually, we all go through harsh desert experiences in our lifetimes. And in order for us to survive those experiences, we also need to learn how to move from being a wanderer to a follower as well. Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 2 through 3 is a great text because it basically describes the real reason why God kept the Israelites in the wilderness for 40 years, rather than just bringing them immediately into the promised land. And yes, they had a chance. They had a chance initially to make it, to enter in early on, but because of their lack of faith, instead of taking the direct route, which was only about 250 miles, they instead spent the next 40 years doing laps around the desert, which added up to about thousands of miles instead. Slow learners, aren't we all? Amen? Okay. So let's read Deuteronomy 8, 2 through 3 and discover why God did this. Here's what it says. Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commandments. He humbled you, causing you to hunger, and then feeding you with manna, which neither you nor your ancestors had known, to teach you that man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes out of the mouth of the Lord. Now notice how this passage starts out saying, remember how God led you in the wilderness for 40 years. And God is basically saying here in this text, I kept you in the wilderness for 40 years to teach you how to follow me. The Israelite survival was predicated on their ability to follow God, and God used hunger as the primary motivational teaching tool to do this. Picture 2 or 3 million men, women and children in that barren desert. There's not enough food source to sustain that group, a group of that proportion. So God supernaturally provides manna for them to eat. But think about how God set this up all those 40 years. They camped, and then they moved. And they camped, and then they moved. And whenever it was time to move to another location in the Sinai, God would manifest himself as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. And then all 3 million of those men, women, and children would need to literally follow God if they wanted their next meal. If anyone didn't follow God, they'd be on their own to survive in that harsh desert environment. They probably wouldn't make it. Hunger was the motivator to follow God, but hunger was only the tool that God used to teach them a deeper spiritual lesson. What is the deeper spiritual lesson? That the pursuit of filling up our tummies every day with food is secondary to the need of filling up our souls with every word that comes from the mouth of God. We all need food to sustain our lives. But listening to and then doing everything that God says is more essential if we want to live a more satisfying and meaningful life. This is the lesson God taught the Israelites in the wilderness. Jesus actually affirms this lesson in an extreme way in Matthew chapter 4, verses 1 through 4. At the beginning, you can put that verse up there, yeah. At the beginning of his ministry, the Spirit of God. So God leads Jesus into the wilderness, and he has him fast for 40 days and 40 nights. That adds up to 1 day for every year the Israelites were in the desert. Don't miss all the ways this passage connects to the Israelite desert experience. And to say that Jesus was hungry after 40 days of fasting is an understatement, because 21 days is typically how long anyone can survive without food, but Jesus has now fasted almost twice that much time. And so he's hanging on the very edge of life here, which is a very vulnerable place to be. And it's in that very vulnerable moment that the devil shows up and basically speaks these words to Jesus. Where has following God ever gotten you? He brought you into this desert to die. He doesn't care about you. I'm the only one that cares about you. Stop following God and follow me. You're the Son of God, for God's sake. Use your power to turn these stones into bread and live. That's a big paraphrase, but that's my take on that discussion. What does Jesus do? He quotes Deuteronomy 8:3 to the devil. As it is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that comes from the mouth of God. Jesus is saying here, until I hear otherwise from God, God is the one who led me here, and so I'll just keep on doing what God has me doing, even if it costs me my life. Take a hike, loser. Now here's where we take a little bit deeper dive into this, okay? So let's go a little deeper. The Hebrew word for wilderness, this is going to blow your mind. The Hebrew word for wilderness or desert is midbar. Midbar. And it comes from the same root as the Hebrew word medaber, which means to speak. The root of this is the word dabar. You can kind of see I've kind of highlighted the root. Hebrew is built mostly on a 3 or 4 letter root. The root there is dabar, the bottom one. You can see it in those other 2 words. Dabar is the word for word in Hebrew. So make a deeper spiritual connection here. God led the Israelites into midbar, the place of speaking, for 40 years to teach them that we don't live by bread alone, but by every dabar, every word that comes from the mouth of God. God took the Israelites into the wilderness to teach them how to follow them, and the way that they were to follow them was to listen to and then do everything he had to say to them. The biblical word Shema means, which is the word to hear, means not only to listen, but you listen in such a way that you obey. And by listening to and then obeying God, they would not only survive in the wilderness, they would actually thrive in the wilderness. And this is why Jesus tells the devil, I'd rather die than miss out on the abundant life that God has for me. Sometime later, after Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, he would go on to say in John 5:19, I don't do anything on my own. I only do what I see my Father doing, because whatever the Father does, that's what I want to do. I want part of that action. Jesus followed God so intently that every moment of his life was spent listening and watching for God's activity to ensure that every one of those moments resulted in a divine appointment. What do you want to do today, Dad? Touch that leper, heal him, done. Tell this person he needs to be born again, bam. Give sight to the blind guy by rubbing mud in his eyes, brilliant. I would have never thought of doing it that way. Multiply a few baskets of fish and bread into a meal for 5,000 people, I'll do it. But let's start a catering business together. It's going to be big. Walk on water, raise a dead guy from back to life. These are the kinds of incredible divine appointments that can happen when we move from wandering around in life to following God instead. Any of this make sense, by the way? Just one head nod? Okay. 2 people are with me. That's double what it normally is. All right. So I want to share a little bit more of what was shared in that video. I want to share my own journey to follow God. I met the Lord in 1982. And it was a pretty powerful, dramatic experience. I didn't believe right away. It took about 8 months, but it dramatically changed my life. I was in business for myself. I was just fine doing that. I was making a really good living. And then God got a hold of me. I've been on the path of downward mobility ever since. But in 1984, so 2 years later, some of these stories you've heard, some of them you haven't, but a lot of people are new, so I'm going to tell them all. In 1984, I had an interesting experience. I was at a meeting in our church, and it was upstairs, and I needed to go to a counseling appointment. In those days, Andrew and I were working on our dysfunction. We were really 2 messed up people that ended up showing up at that church in 1982. And we began to work on things, and I needed to get to a counseling appointment. So I left the meeting, and I went downstairs, and I'm getting ready to leave the building, and I heard a distinct voice, whether it was in my head or out here, I'm not sure, but it said, go down the hall. So I'm trying out the door, the hallway's this way, I'm late, I wanted to get there on time. I said, I'm just hearing things. I start to leave, go down the hall. So I turn and I go down the hall, and they had an auditorium that had some glass doors, and I looked inside. The lights are on. I think, oh, you want me to turn the lights off? I'll turn it off as soon as I get back from the counseling appointment. Do it now. So I open up the doors. The controls for the lights were in a sound booth. You had to climb up this fire ladder to get there. I get into the sound booth, and I go to press off the lights, and I look, and there are 2 teenage boys hiding under the table. I was the youth pastor at the time. I don't know these 2 teenage boys. So I said, what are you doing there? Nothing. And there's about $40,000, $50,000 of sound equipment up there, and I go, come with me. And I was surprised that they did. They followed me into the room where I was having a meeting, and I said, I found these boys under the table. I don't know what they're doing there. We began to drill them. After about 5 minutes, one of the boys says, F you, and they both ran out the door. We found out later on that there were 2 boys that had run away from a boys' home that was about 3 miles from the church facility. They said they came in to get out of the rain. It was raining that day. So the next day, I asked God, I go, what was that all about? I mean, that was the most insane experience I've ever had of hearing your voice, but why did it go sideways? He goes, well, everything was going fine until you stopped listening to me, and you took over. So I learned something about that. 2 years later, Andrew and I are in India on a short-term mission trip. We went to India and Africa. It was about a month-long missions trip. And I'm walking on the hotel roof building in what back then was called Bombay, now is Mumbai, with the pastor of the church that I was attending. And I heard a distinct voice of God saying, you're going to go into ministry. And I'm thinking, what? I mean, first of all, I'm happy doing business. I don't really know anything, even though I was raised Jewish. We Jews, we don't read our Bibles. We just read prayers. I don't know anything about the Bible. And I don't have, how am I going to go? I probably have to go to seminary. But I heard a distinct voice, and it really was a game-changing day for me, because it was on that day that Andrew and I began to make plans for me to go to seminary and move in this direction, even though it made no sense at all at the time. In 1994, Andrew and I began we loved the church that we're at in California, Voyagers Bible Church, Irvine, California. We wanted to be there forever, but we began to hear from God that maybe we were supposed to leave the nest and go somewhere. And so that didn't make sense to us. Like, why? Why would we leave? We want to be here. But in obedience, we found out this little group of people here in Boulder, Colorado, were looking for a pastor to come so that they could be a church. And nothing about coming here made sense at all. The church had very little money. My elders had warned me about coming here. Something's not right at this church, And it's Boulder, listed as the second least religious city in America. To come here, it just, none of it made sense. But God did, I don't know how you sort things out, but God did some miraculous things to convince us that if we didn't come here, that we'd be out of his will. And we did come here, and I guess it worked out okay. In 1999, as you heard on that video, the church that was meeting here gave us this free building. Now that sounds like a good deal, but the free building wasn't in the picture in the beginning. And this place needed about $300,000 of repairs just to get us in here. It sits on a cul-de-sac. It's got no curb appeal, and we just weren't sure whether or not this made any sense. But God did so many things, and I've shared these before, in the column of He's working, including having this couple come to us who had no idea that we were looking at this building, and the husband had sold a business, and he gave us a check, and the check was for $270,000, $30,000 short. I'm saying, God, we need 300. Okay, 30,000 short. But it was just one of many signs that we didn't come here. We'd be out of God's will, and so we did that. In 2001, several pastors in this area and myself rented a van, and we took what we called a magical mystery tour. We went to several human service organizations in Boulder, loaded with 2 questions. Number 1, do you know who we are? Number 2, if we were to close our doors today, would it make any difference in your business? And we kind of knew what the answer was, but we wanted to hear it. Every person said, well, we don't know who you are. You don't really do anything with us, and you seem like really nice people, but if you were to leave tomorrow, it really wouldn't impact us at all. That really devastated me just to hear it from these folks. Because we'd been there, so that was 2001. We'd been there already 7 years. No impact in this city. Nobody even knew who we were. And so a couple weeks later, I volunteered 2 hours a week at the Boulder County AIDS Project for the next 2 years, just because I wanted to learn what it's like to serve this city. That was the beginning of changing our DNA and our culture here to being a church where today the city of Boulder would miss us. We have and not just city of Boulder, but so many places around the world where we're having an impact. In 2004, I was coming to church on a Sunday morning. It was early. It was still dark. I was way behind in planning. Back in those days, I was still preaching and leading worship, and I wore all the hats here. And I'm driving down from Louisville, halfway down, and I hear a voice again. I hadn't really heard that distinct voice since that time at Voyagers Bible Church. And the voice said, go to NCAR. Go to NCAR. I'm really busy. I start, again, kind of playing with the thought, is that me or is that God or what is that? I pulled all the way into this parking lot and I sat in a stall right there having this argument with this voice. No, I've got to catch up on stuff. I've got to print some sheet music out. I got to look at my message. And I kept hearing it over and over again, go to NCAR. So I figure I'm going to go to NCAR, and when I get there, I'm going to bump into somebody, just like I did these two kids, only this time I'm going to get it right? I'm going to keep listening to God. So I drive up there. It's still pitch black. I pull into the parking lot. I drive around a little bit. There's nobody there at 5:30 in the morning. And so I decided, well, I'm just going to pray. So I pulled up on the edge of the parking lot overlooking to the east into Boulder. And as I began to pray, the sun started coming up. And as the sun started coming up, I just started to weep, a bawl like a baby. I couldn't even explain it. And within just a few minutes, it went from dark to light. And I heard God say, if I can light up the world in 5 minutes, I can light up Boulder anytime. And he told me to go back to the pastors here and organize 4 citywide prayer and worship services, which I did. I went back and I told him the story, and one of the guys put his hand on my back and said, Gene, we've done that before. The same 20 people show up every time. I said, but that was a pretty profound story. We'll do it. We held the first one at Boulder Valley Christian Church. 600 people showed up. It was amazing. The second one, it was at Vine Life. About 1,200 people showed up. The next one at Rocky Mountain Christian, about 1,600 people showed up. And the fourth one at Rocky Mountain Christian, another 1,600 to 1,800 people. They were so powerful. For me personally and for Cornerstone personally, something cracked open here in the city of Boulder because of that. We have just had favor after favor since that time. It was a very powerful experience. In 2016, I began to hear the Lord say, it's time to hand over the leadership baton. Just like me never wanting to leave Voyagers Bible Church, I wasn't ready to step aside. But there were so many things that happened that I was convinced that this was the timing. And Brian and I met, we wept together because it was like a profound moment. It's my time to step aside. Brian, it's your time to come up here. And look at the wisdom that God had, because what we're doing right now with Dream Boulder, that's not me. I love what we're doing. But Brian is the talking face that is so unexpectedly awesome that we're in such capable hands for someone to kind of lead the charge. And I could see God's wisdom in that. Which brings us to Dream Boulder. We began to hear from God that, when you start thinking about the kind of growth, you wouldn't know it today because it's President's Weekend, and I think a lot of people are skiing, but this room is packed. It's packed at 10:45, and it's getting packed at 5:30 at the same time. And so about really almost 8 or 9 months ago, talking to Brian about what are our next steps, we began to hear God speak to us about this project. And it's absolutely exciting to think about it. To invite you to be part of a legacy, to leave behind for the next 2 or 3 generations a facility that can invite more people to be a part of what God's doing here. This church, this building, is one day it's going to rot. But what happens in here is going to last forever. And that's awesome. And then one more thing I want to share that I've shared a bunch of times. And worship team can come up here in a few minutes. I want to tell you one more story. In John chapter 6, Jesus feeds 5,000 people. Remember that story? He's got a couple baskets of fish and bread, and in faith they pass it around, and when it all comes back, they actually have leftovers. They have fed 5,000 people. It's an incredible miracle. Jesus puts the disciples in a boat to go across the Sea of Galilee while he goes up to spend some time with the Father. Then he comes down. This is where he walks on water. He gets in the boat, and they get to the other side, and this crowd of 5,000 people have followed the boat all the way to the other side. So they've walked, and when they get there, and you can put this verse up here, they said, "Rabbi, when did you get here?" I love that because it's kind of like, oh, wow, we just happened to bump into you, you know? No, they followed him. And Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, you're looking for me not because you saw the signs I performed, but because you ate the loaves." I don't know if you can see what's going on here, but instead of saying, "We want to live our lives like you do, Jesus," that was awesome. We want to live from one divine appointment to the next. We want to impact our world for God like you're impacting the world. No. They just wanted another meal. They just wanted to live from one meal to the next. And so Jesus says to them in the next verse, "Do not work for food that spoils, but for food that endures to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give you. For on him God the Father has placed a seal of approval." Then they asked, "What must we do to do the work God requires?" And Jesus says, "The work of God is this, to believe in the one he has sent." Now, he's got the desert wilderness in view here. He's got manna in view. Do not work for food that spoils. Remember the caveat? You could go out 6 days a week, and you could collect food, and on the sixth day, you could get a double portion, so you don't have to collect it on the Sabbath. But you have to only collect as much as you can eat that day. Because if you try to keep it overnight, it's going to spoil. Do not work for food that spoils, right? And so that's what happened. If you happen to collect more than you could eat, and you tried to keep it in your cupboard overnight, when you woke up in the morning, it had maggots in it. And so what Jesus is saying here, when he has this in view, don't work for food that spoils. Now, even though God said that you couldn't collect more than you could eat in a night and that it would spoil, there were still plenty of people that went out and tried to collect more food. And it would spoil. And then they'd do it another time, and it would spoil. And it would keep on spoiling. Now, it does not make sense to go out every day and to collect food or to collect anything that's just going to spoil, does it? And yet, isn't that what most of us do with our life? We go out every day and we collect things that are just going to spoil. And so the lesson of the manna is that every time an Israelite went out and collected just what they needed for that day, that's called faith. Because they trusted that God would come through the next day. And he did for 40 years. On the other hand, for any Israelite that went out and collected more than they needed, because they just didn't, just in case God doesn't come through tomorrow, I'm going to put a little bit extra in the cupboard. That's called disbelief. God wants you and I to be people of faith. Do not work for food that spoils. food that endures to eternal life. So as you think about this building is going to spoil eventually. That's not what we're asking for. We're asking to increase our influence in things that last forever. That's what Dream Boulder is about. So let's stand up together. And I heard this quote that somebody said, if your dream doesn't scare you, it's not big enough. So for those of you like me and everybody else on our staff and our elders who are scared to death about jumping into this, because this is new to all of us, this is a dream that's big enough to fear. But faith overcomes fear, and that's where we're going. Let's just read. Let's finish by just reading. You guys can keep playing, but let's just read Jesus' prayer. He told us how to pray, because I think this all fits with this message, and I think you'll see it as we read it together. Here we go. Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not in temptation, but deliver us from evil. For yours is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever.